Today's learners live in an age of unforeseen challenges. Education can be a pathway for personal transformation, and it has the power to lead to the societal and global changes we need to build a just, sustainable, and peaceful future for all. But to do this, education itself has to transform, so everyone can learn the knowledge, skills, and values to care for each other and act for the planet. Welcome to the 5th UNESCO Forum on Transformative Education for Sustainable Development, Global Citizenship, Health, and Well-being. A global discussion on where we stand on realizing transformative education. Together, we can build a better future.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this third and last day of the UNESCO Forum on Transformative Education. My name is Vibeke Jensen, and I'm Director of the Division for Education for Peace and Sustainable Development here at UNESCO headquarters. And it's going to be my great pleasure to moderate the fourth plenary session this morning. For this last day, we open this session with the purpose to really try and capture and summarize, synthesize some of the many key ideas and perspectives that have been shared over the past 2 days. And in particular, link back to some of the recommendations also coming out of the parallel sessions on the first day in particular, on policy, pedagogy, and also safe schools. In particular, we will highlight recommendations that were formulated on how to improve and consolidate the implementation of transformative education, as well as the key factors identified as success indicators for progress. But before we move into that, let me just say a few words about the 1974 recommendation concerning education for international understanding, cooperation, and peace and education related to human rights and fundamental freedoms. Because just a couple of weeks ago, the UNESCO's General Conference decided to launch the work for the next 2 years of revising this important set of recommendations, which since 1974 have constituted the overarching framework for the formulation of norms in the implementation of education in support of peace, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. It is very interdisciplinary in nature and covers education for the promotion of cultural diversity, tolerance, human survival, and well-being, and it links education and culture. In short, all of the key themes which are encapsulated in Sustainable Development Goal 4, and in particular in target number 7. As many of you will know, UNESCO spearheads the monitoring of the progress towards target 4.7. And given the target's unique and novel focus on the content, the relevance and purpose of education, monitoring is indeed challenging, but progress continues to be made. And this is what we have also been discussing for the past 2 days in the forum. Now, the reporting on the 1974 recommendations also provides the data needed for the global SDG indicators 4.7.1, 12.8.1, and also 13.3.1, which were published for the first time in June 2021, so just half a year ago, in the UN's Global SDG Indicator Database. The purpose of starting this work of revising the recommendations is to basically achieve 3 main objectives, namely to strengthen the relevance and effectiveness of this instrument in the face of contemporary global challenges, such as climate change, spread of hateful and violent ideologies online and offline, and enduring inequalities. And also reinforce the unity of UNESCO's membership around the commitment they made in 1974 in support of education for a better, more sustainable, more just and peaceful world. And finally, the third purpose is to adapt to the global policy landscape and the education sector itself, which have undergone as you all know, tremendous change, such as the digital revolution, which needs to be fully harnessed. So this work of revising the recommendations actually will start from tomorrow. And I just wanted to mention it here at the opening of this important plenary session, because really all the recommendations and all the great ideas that you have made over the past couple of days, and that we will try and synthesize in this session, really will feed into this work, which we hope will end in 2023 with a set of revised recommendations to be adopted by UNESCO's General Conference in November 23. But let me now introduce our eminent panel for this morning. We have with us Chandrika Bahadur, who is the director of the SDG Academy. And before that, she has also been the president of Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and she has worked in the UN for some years. So welcome, Chandrika. We also have with us live from Seoul, Aaron Benavot, professor at the University of Albany in the United States. And his work is focusing on comparative and international education. And he also formerly worked for quite a number of years as the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report, hosted here at UNESCO headquarters. So also a warm welcome to you, and good to have you very live with us from Seoul, Aaron. We also have with us from Sri Lanka, Mr. Nilantha Gunasekara, who is the Deputy Director of School Health and Nutrition Branch of the Ministry of Education in Sri Lanka. Before that, he has passed a number of years, 16 years, I think, as a school principal also in Sri Lanka. And delighted to have you with us, sir. And we have with us Katarina Popovic, who is Professor, Department of Andragogy, University of Belgrade, Serbia, and also Secretary General of the International Council for Adult Education. And Katarina has a long experience in adult education and is also the author of many publications on the subject. So also welcome to you, Katarina. And finally, we also have with us from Seoul, live, Mr. Hyun, who is director of APCEIU, our co-host, and based in Seoul in the Republic of Korea. And Mr. Lim is a very close friend and colleague of UNESCO, but because he has a long career in the UNESCO National Commission, in particular as Deputy Secretary General of the National Commission. And so we are also delighted to have you with us. So thank you all for being here, and we look forward to the next 1.5 hours of conversation around the recommendations coming out of the forum. But before I hand over to the panelists, let me invite my colleague, Alexander Leicht, to present a summary of what we have picked up from the conversations over the past 2 days. So Alexander, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vibeke. Very happy to be able to, in a very, very brief way, share some conclusions that we've tried to take from the very rich sessions and from the very rich discussions over the last couple of days. They're really high quality presentations, and we've taken diligent note and tried to digest it really as a conversation starter for this session. And on the next slide, my first slide, you can see some elements of transformative education that kept coming up in the various sessions. First of all, of course, transformative education is a very ambitious concept, a kind of learning that really aims to change the world. Another sort of phrase that kept being referred to was the idea of learning to care for oneself, for the others, and for the planet. So this very, very ambitious concept that discussions revolved around. Also very well established the idea of the 3 learning dimensions that interact and that need to be there in transformative education in a balanced way, the cognitive, social, and emotional and behavioral learning dimensions, with a real emphasis on education that leads to action, leads to real world action to change the world. And then, of course, our various themes or issues or concepts, including sustainability, global citizenship, health and well-being as key ingredients of transformative education, and then also equally well established and recurring in many discussions that transformative education happens in formal, non-formal, and informal settings, and is relevant for all ages. Also, very often we've heard an emphasis on lifelong learning and adult education. On the next slide, we've identified a few pedagogical elements and enablers of transformative education. First of all, an experiential and explorative learning that involves head, heart, and hand in a way corresponding to the 3 learning dimensions of cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral. Then a context-sensitive curriculum that is tied to relevant issues on the ground that directly impact learners and their community. So the idea is really for learners to learn while they interact with real life challenges, real life problems in their communities, in their daily lives, as concerns citizenship, as concerns sustainability, as concerns health and well-being. What is also needed is a nurturing, supportive, and non-violent learning environment without bullying, without other forms of violence, and that leads to the important concept of the whole school approach that kept coming up also in the discussions and has come up before, of course, in the discussions around transformative education. The idea that the whole school environment is created in a way that it promotes transformative learning with regard to the learning content, but then also with regard to the governance of the institution, with regard to a green campus and a violence-free campus, for example. And then also the last point we highlighted here is the importance of a meaningful formative assessment that really goes beyond sort of the classic standardized testing. And that leads me to my next slide, where we have put together a few challenges and obstacles for the implementation of transformative education. First of all, the widespread culture of reductionist testing, really. There is a lot of teaching to the test, as has been pointed out variously. And when testing is done, it is very often done in a narrow way, with a strong focus on basic skills only, and not so much on the skills and dispositions that are important for transformative education. In that context, also a challenge is also the outdated views of the nature and purpose of education, a very narrow view of education, very often promoted on the ground by stakeholders, sometimes very much focused on sort of workplace readiness, which is of course very, very important, but certainly from a transformative education perspective, education cannot be reduced to this goal. We see a very scattered and unsystematic implementation at country level, often very much around sort of pilot projects, good practice projects, but we don't very often see a systematic integration across the whole education sector. There's insufficient recognition of the importance of adult and non-formal education that was pointed out by various discussants. The important role of teachers, and in particular the challenge the teachers are motivated, as our study that we presented at the forum also shows, our survey, but they're not always sufficiently supported in their intention to teach and facilitate transformative learning. And finally, there's little consensus on what to measure when tracking progress in transformative education. And that leads me to my next slide, where we have compiled a few recommendations, certainly not an exhaustive list, but we tried to sort of pull out what has been mentioned most often and what seemed to be most relevant. First of all, develop policies that support the integration of transformative education across the education sector. So the importance of an enabling policy environment was pointed out variously. then the mainstreaming of sustainability, global citizenship, and health and well-being across the whole curriculum. Not so much the creation of an additional subject. Certainly, discussants were very aware of the problem of curriculum overload. So the idea is really to mainstream across the whole curriculum, integrate basically into every subject. Enhancing the whole school approach, another recommendation, and widen the whole school approach to a whole of community approach that brings together formal and non-formal learning, where basically outside of the school walls also a learning process towards sustainability and global citizenship and health and well-being takes place. Participants recommended to invest in teachers at all levels, to really provide teachers with the necessary support they need to teach transformative education. Fifth, the recommendation to co-create pedagogies, materials, and monitoring mechanisms, and to support students, teachers, and other education stakeholders in this co-creation. That was also another important idea that came up various times. And then the recommendation to develop and expand easy-to-use monitoring mechanisms that help countries to evaluate their progress, setting clear targets where we need the balancing act between sort of a very sophisticated monitoring mechanism that really sort of captures everything that is relevant to transformative education on the one end of the spectrum, but on the other end of the spectrum also the need to be practicable and to be really easy to implement for countries. So that was my quick run through the elements of transformative education, pedagogies, challenges, and a few key recommendations that, as I mentioned, are certainly not exhaustive. Thank you very much, and back to you, Vibeke.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for this very concise presentation. And I mean, not an easy job given the very, very rich discussions we've had over the past 2 days. And maybe for that reason, I will turn to our panelists and just ask them to give their 2 minutes quick reactions to this presentation, to these recommendations, and maybe from your perspective, say if you see anything important missing, or you know how you would what your perspective on these recommendations are. So 2 minutes first, then we will move on with more elaborate questions and take another 2 rounds of conversations around the table. But if I may stay, maybe can I invite Chandrika? Would you want to give your first quick take on the recommendations? Chandrika, over to you.
Thank you, Vibeke. Can you hear me?
We hear you clearly.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and for inviting me to the panel, but also for this excellent summary, Alexander, because I think it really does capture what has happened over the last couple of days. For us at the SDG Academy and STSN, it is my first reaction is one of tremendous optimism to hear how central the elements of transformative education appear to have become in a relatively short amount of time. So it's very heartening to see all of these elements reflected in the discussions. As some of you know, we are also part of Mission 4.7, which is a multi-organization effort partnering with UNESCO and with the Ban Ki-moon Center to essentially promote very much the elements of transformative education. So my first reaction to this is one of, I think, both pleasure but also optimism. I do want to highlight what I would characterize as 4 tensions and 1 opportunity as a reaction to what Alexander has presented. The first tension, and Alexander alluded to it a little bit, is that of the question of additionality. I think when we are talking about much of this curriculum, we have to ask ourselves, what does it replace in terms of what children are actually learning? As a very practical reality of the finite working hours that teachers have, the finite school hours that children have, particularly over the last 1.5 years, where we've seen a huge restriction on the amount of time being spent on curriculum. So I think that is one tension that does need to be resolved. Now, here the main tension that I see is that mainstreaming is, in an ideal world, the answer would be every subject is taught integrating the principles of transformative education. That is the ideal world. The real world is very different. And so the moment there is a focus on specific learning outcomes associated with each of the elements of transformative education, the mainstreaming inevitably becomes harder. Because then are you tracking the process by which children are learning, or are you tracking what they are learning? And so we'll very quickly jump to the conversation on indicators. So I want to leave it there as a tension, because I think that is central to making this a reality. The second tension is that not all of this is new. A lot of elements of this curriculum exist. A lot of the concepts do get taught, but as Alexander pointed out, it is sporadic, not systematic. And so I think one messaging coming out of here would be very much to build on what is already present in education systems, and to try and not necessarily present this as a fundamentally new concept, but rather as a holistic concept in a way that didn't happen before. So that's I would say those are the first two tensions. The third tension is regarding the reductionist testing. Now, it is true that in most education systems are geared towards preparing children for work, for life in the labor force. And I don't think we can wish that away. Particularly in low and middle income countries, education is seen as the pathway out of poverty. And that is a huge impetus for parents struggling with very deep economic challenges to still prioritize schooling and send their children to school. So there is an instrumentality, which I don't think we should ignore. And the way out of this tension is actually to focus on how transformative education can help young people earn their livelihoods, how it can help them do better in the context of the world that we're going to be living in the next few decades. And I think, again, there are lots of things that can be done there in terms of framing what transformative education really aims to do. The next tension, I think, is between what has been discussed extensively, which is the values that underpin education around preventing hate, preventing conflict, dealing with misinformation. The tension is between these values and what children might learn in a classroom versus the reality of the world that they live in. And the sources of the misinformation, the sources of the conflict, which a lot of it is driven by technology, but a lot of it is also driven by societal forces that are sort of larger than purely the education system. So I think this is something we do need to talk about in terms of how do we harness the powers of what transformative education can do to really address the reality, the overall reality, and the world that people live in. So those are the tensions, and I want to end with the opportunity. I do think that now, post-pandemic, when schools have seen academic disruptions of anywhere between a few months to a year and a half, there is a real opportunity for a reset. And this is really the time for it, because I think there is a lot of young people who are going back into the education system have experienced something that we cannot properly understand, I think, for many years to come. In terms of the disruption. So there is an opportunity now to do things differently, which will go away. It's a very small window, and it'll go away once life goes back to business as usual. So I think this is the time to take advantage of that opportunity and move fairly quickly in terms of rethinking how education is designed and delivered. Vibeke, let me stop there, and we can take up some of these issues later in the session.
Thank you, Chandrika, very, very much for these first reactions, and thank you for starting off on a positive, optimistic note. And I think also leaving on that, the four tensions that you highlighted, I think are very, very pertinent: challenges, obstacles, things that we have to deal with and really find ways of overcoming in order to push the agenda forward. But thank you so much, Chandrika, for these first observations. May I now turn to Katarina Popovic for your first observations?
Yes, thank you very much.
Katarina,
thank you. And I want to congratulate first to the fruitful discussions and to the nice presentation, nice summary that Alexander gave to us. And in my first reaction, I would like to welcome the holistic approach that was obviously the main spirit of the discussion in the previous 2 days. And I'm welcoming that because this high ambition that Alexander mentioned, transformation that should change the world, it's possible only if education and learning really happen in all settings, formal, non-formal, informal. So I would also suggest then to talk more about educational sites and learning sites and not only about the school, because if you want to transform the whole society, then it really has to include all those different types of settings. But they were included, and I would really like to underline the importance of this inclusion. My second compliment goes to the inclusion of all ages, which was mentioned also in recommendations that Alexander presented to us. And why is it so important? Our language is still very much about children and youth, and we are talking about lifelong learning. And lifelong learning should really be from cradle to grave. There is additional reason, not only conceptual one, why we need to include all ages. We are all aware of the sense of urgency. For example, in relation to the Agenda 2030, let me remind you of the report of the Secretary General, UN Secretary General report to the high-level political forum, where this sense of urgency was really underlined. We are aware of the consequences of financial crisis. There is a climate crisis, there is a health crisis now. So it's a very clear message. We need to act now. So we cannot limit our actions and our ambitions only to one institution, being it so important as school, but really including all learning sites. And also we cannot limit it to one age group, like children and youth, although they are the most important one. But because of this urgency and because of the planet cannot wait and the people cannot wait, we need really to be comprehensive and all-inclusive and also move our language from children to learners, and learners meaning learners of all age. The next point, and I would like to underline and to complement, is the inclusion of 3 dimensions: cognitive, social, and emotional. The good old head, heart, and hand. We haven't heard it for ages, and I think it's very, very valid, especially if we talk about peace and tolerance and transformation. I really think it's important to have all those aspects in mind. Another aspect was also mentioned, behavioral, and this is indeed very important, but I would suggest to use more wording like agency, developing the agency, and not so much behavioral changes, because if we talk so much about behavior, we underline the adaptive role of education and learning. And if talking about the agency, something that moves, something that develops capacity to change, then we underline the transformative role of learning and education. The list of challenges and obstacles that was presented is, well, they are very well perceived. Some important challenges are lacking. Unfortunately, we never lack obstacles. And I would be glad also to add a bit later some of them. But I believe this list can initiate very well the discussion on what should be done to remove these obstacles and what should be done to make progress in transformation. But I believe we'll talk about that in the next round. So much for the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Katarina, for these excellent comments, really. And thank you for also, you know, reminding of this urgency that we really are facing, because the world so badly needs that we do education differently. Also, thank you for your comment on the behavioral versus agency. Very excellent comment, and we'll get back, I think, to some of these things as we unpack further the issues in the conversation to come. Thank you. Aaron, can I turn to you in Seoul? Aaron Benavot, your 2 minutes and your first reaction, please.
Thanks so much, Vibeke. I too would like to begin with some congratulations. Having spent quite a few years at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, I guess that when I left, I couldn't imagine that UNESCO education sector would organize a international forum that was entitled Transformative Education. I think that the sector has gone a long way in conceiving a concept, an idea, although it has deeper roots, that really speaks to a much more dynamic idea about an education vision that goes beyond many of the terms and concepts that had been promoted up until now. So I certainly congratulate the leadership at the UNESCO, the education sector at UNESCO. I think this is a very interesting move forward. And I would also congratulate the member states in their support for going back to one of these, to the 1974 recommendation, which most of us would not have spent a lot of time thinking about until we had to, let's say, monitor target 4.7. But this is a very interesting recommendation, very broad, very in-depth, very comprehensive. It really is a wonderful place to begin to rethink some very basic policy ideas going forward. And certainly, you know, the member states have also agreed with a whole new set of priorities in the last few years, certainly to highlight the role of higher education, of technical vocational education, which hadn't been on the agenda, and certainly many other ideas. I must say many of the ideas that have been put forward by my two colleagues, both Chandrika and Katarina, are things that I agree with and I think are very important to keep in mind. One of the things that I would like to point out is that, you know, this idea of transformative education is something that UNESCO didn't, let's say, create or conjure up, but rather if you, as an academic, you look through the academic literature, there are actually many scholars, many researchers, certainly even more so over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years that have been very interested in this idea of transformative education. So one of the ways I think that UNESCO as an international agency can help to legitimate this idea is to, you know, draw upon some of the research that's going on around the notion of transformative education. Albeit most of the studies are focused on countries in the global north, but I think that many of the models and ideas and some of the arguments being put forward are things that also can be drawn out of the literature. So that would be, I think, a very important way forward. But let's not be mistaken. There are some very significant obstacles, some of which I think my colleagues have mentioned. I've been working with APCEIU, my colleague here in Seoul, in South Korea, trying to analyze the content of the curriculum of 23 Asia-Pacific countries, looking very carefully at the curricular frameworks, at subject syllabi, and trying to capture issues around global citizenship. And this is no easy matter. We ended up, you know, spending literally months trying to identify where it's being taught. So beyond articulating a vision, and this really picks up, I think, Chandrika's point, it is trying to, first of all, understand what are the realities on the ground and how can we build from those existing realities and make them better or improve upon them or expand upon them. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges. We don't have currently a kind of repository of official documents and other kinds of information that speak to the content, the purposes of education. And I'm mainly making reference to formal education. And here I would only further echo the point that Katarina has made, that if we really are going to be looking at transformative education that speaks not just about children and youth, but also about adults, how little we actually know about the non-formal educational frameworks and activities that are going on in many parts of the world. We simply don't have the kind of substantive knowledge about the numbers of people, the extent to which they're involved, what kind of impact it has on their lives, and following up on this kind of thing. So trying to capture what is realities on the ground and then working from those to bring about this kind of vision of transformative education, I think, is key. And with that, I'll end my initial comment.
Thank you, Aaron, for both these nice words, but also excellent recommendations about really building on what is already there and expanding our research and our understanding of what is happening on the ground, as both you and Chandrika said. I couldn't agree more. I'm so happy you're sitting in Seoul and not in Albany, because then it would be in the middle of the night, and I had my concerns about waking you up at such an odd hour. So great to have you there in Seoul. Can I now move on to your neighbor in Seoul, Mr. Mook Lim, Director of APCEIU and a co-organizer, and thanks for that, Mr. Lim, of this forum.
Thank you, Vibeke. I'll try to be very brief for the sake of time. I think Alexander's presentation on the takeaways of the forum is excellent. I think it has captured very well the rich discussions we had and the inspiring messages we shared during this forum. I appreciate very much. I would like to add just one point in the recommendations. It is about assessment. Alexander mentioned about the culture of testing, which is too much competitive and contributing a lot to the loss of joy of learning. But there is no mention about assessment in the recommendations. So I suggest that we include something about supportive assessment for learning, not assessment of learning. Assessment should be made to help learners learn, so it should be assessment for learning, not of learning. This is very important. If assessment is not changed, we can hardly change education. Curriculum, teachers' capacity, school leadership, and collaboration with community are all important. But don't forget assessment. To students and parents, the most important thing may be assessment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lim, and also thank you for highlighting this point that this whole issue of assessment for learning and not of learning, I think indeed came out in quite a few of the sessions yesterday and on Monday. So we'll make sure that gets highlighted. Let me now, I realize it's getting more and more difficult as we move down the list of panel speakers to say new things. So I'll now invite Mr. Gunasekara to see if you have any quick words you would want to add to what has already been said. Mr. Gunasekara.
Thank you, Vibeke. First of all, I would like to thank a great presentation done by Mr. Alexander. I have only one suggestion. I don't take any time. I think when you consider about the social and emotional development of the student, what is the role of online teaching session, online teaching platform? I think recently most of the time we close the school, then our teaching methods doing ongoing online session. As an online session, I think now we think about how can we develop student mental well-being through the online, using online session or like that. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for highlighting, I think, what is a very, very important point and an issue that really also requires a lot more understanding and research and how the whole social and emotional learning and the digital and online learning, which has become so important after or in the middle of the pandemic, really go together. So thank you for that comment, Mr. Gunasekara. I think we now have a small break and I'll hand over to my colleague Hyun who would also want to get a sense from the audience what they think and their take on the recommendations and highlights from the last 2 days. June, over to you.
Thank you, Vibeke. Can you hear me right? Okay, so we have prepared one last question using Slido. Can we put up the slide, please? Yes. So I think everyone knows by now how to use this Slido. Please either use this QR code or open your device and type slido.com. And please use this code 623-116, 623-116. And one question that we prepared is the following. What is the most important element to be included, strengthened in the education sector for effectively putting into practice transformative education? What is the most important element to be included, strengthened in the education sector for effectively putting into practice transformative education? Thank you. So we will show the results in coming minutes. This is an open question, so please just type whatever ideas that you may have, and we will see the results in a couple more minutes. Okay, maybe 30 more seconds. Now we are having around 50 participants who are responding. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I would still encourage the audience to continue typing, but maybe this list, it was very encouraging to see that many of the keywords at least highlighted again also by the audience as Alexander presented this morning. And UNESCO will make it sure to take note of all your comments put here. So please continue putting on, but maybe we can send it back to Vibeke. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, June, and thank you to everyone who contributed to this. As June just said, I think there are both some ideas that have been mentioned, but there are certainly also many new ideas. So I think very useful. And as June said, we have taken really good note and will take good note of everything being put also on the Slido. Let me go back to the panel and just so everyone is clear, we are now going into a little bit, you will have a little bit more speaking time this time around, and then we'll have one final round where I'll ask you to just respond to one kind of fairly simple question quite briefly. But the question I would like to discuss and unpack with you now is really, I mean, we know that all of this is very country specific, of course, but what would you say from where you sit, panelist, what are the most critical factors in progressing transformative education? I mean, Aaron said, and I agree with him, it's not a very new concept per se. It has been around for a while, it has been talked about for a while. But what we really want to see now is some acceleration in its implementation, because as some of you pointed to, the urgency of the situation that we are in as a planet and as a people. So I will start with Chandrika, if that's okay with you, Chandrika. What would you, I mean, you already gave a very comprehensive comments up front, but what would you further say? What is it, what are the most critical factors in really implementing transformative education and accelerating things happening? Chandrika, please.
Thank you, Vibeke. So I'm going to pick up from what a lot of the other panelists have also spoken about. And I think the first thing that I see as a critical factor for large-scale success, which is, I think, what we're really looking for in a relatively short amount of time, would be how we think about curriculum integration on one hand, but also redesign. And I want to elaborate on a little bit of what I was beginning to say initially, which is that I think we have to be very cognizant of the fact that in a lot of countries, the curriculum is overloaded. So what children are expected to learn in an academic year, relative to what their the support that is available to them, relative to the kind of base level learning that is present, is many times unrealistic and many times overwhelming. So I think that's the reality of many large public education systems. So in this context, I think if we're talking about transformative education, there is a very real need to take this principle of integration and mainstreaming, which the forum has brought out, but to really think about how does this get done in the context of everything else that children need to learn. And so the fundamental question then is not necessarily purely about transformative education. It is about what is it that we would like children to learn and how to prepare them for the world that they live in. And this is a very fundamental question. It's been, educators have been grappling with this for decades, but it's critical right now because we know that again, what the forum referred to as an outdated model of education is coming up to reality at this moment. So if you're going to move away from a system designed for, assembly line workers and repetitive work situations, and if you're going to change that around to systems that equip people to live in a world of uncertainty, to live in a world where analysis and interpretation is going to be valued more than the mechanical performance of tasks, where we are looking at large-scale automation, do we really keep the same curriculum? That's kind of the first question. And in the context of that, what is it about the elements of transformative education that need to come in and how? So I would say that's the first, and getting that right is going to be a critical factor, because otherwise what's going to happen is that there may be wonderful syllabi designed around transformative education, but they will come secondary to what the core is that children are learning. And so if we don't want that to happen, then this has to be done together with the fundamental redesign. The second critical factor, I would say, is technology. I think Dr. Gunasekara made reference to it. We at the STG Academy have technology in our DNA. That's the only way we disseminate our educational content. And what I think, where we are right now, again, post-pandemic, is a situation where a lot of the barriers that were there, behavioral barriers to technology, have fallen away. Now, there's still very much the reality of a digital divide. So there's the least resourced places in the world are where the online education is not really a reality. But that is a problem that I believe will get solved over the years. It'll require a push. But what technology offers us is, again, getting back to the first point I was making, is to help figure out, are there different ways of learning that does not, are there particular content topics, or are there particular subjects for which children don't need to be in the classroom and learn? That this is something that can be done through technology, and therefore you free up space. So you actually create a blended model that allows for the classroom to be the place where a lot of the transformative education learning happens, and then the interaction with the device to be a place where other kinds of learning happens. And that kind of leads me to my third critical factor, which is, I think, what Katarina was talking about, which is lifelong learning. Most of the learners of the STG Academy are adults. A lot of them are working professionals. And they come to learn about sustainable development because either they're interested or they are required by work to do this. And I think there again, understanding the incentives and making the material available in a flexible way is going to be absolutely critical for uptake. So that I would say is the third success factor. And the last one, I want to come back to teacher training and support. I do think that a lot of the pedagogical elements that have been outlined in the forum are entirely at odds with current teaching practices around the world. This is not what teachers are trained for. They're not trained to deal with uncertainty in a classroom. They're not trained to deal with helping children learn how to think. They're not trained for the kind of interactive, experiential, value-based learning that we're talking about here. And many of them want to. This is not a question of desire or intent. It is a question of what are the skills that they have. And so unless there is a focus on changing how teachers are trained and how teachers are taught, not just pre-service, but also in service, we're not going to be able to see this situation actually change in the way we want it to be. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Chandrika, for these additional points, which are really all of them extremely important. In the best interest of time, because I see the clock is running, I'll move on to Katarina. Katarina, would you like to unpack a little bit more some of your ideas?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for giving me opportunity to continue with talking about the role of adult education as the longest part in the chain of lifelong learning and its potential for transformative education. Well, as you know, especially non-formal adult education is more flexible and more responsive to the needs of the environment and has this transformative potential in it. But there is an important aspect that I would like to underline. If education is supposed to be transformative, it should move away from pure adaptive and corrective function, which is of course needed to cope with the daily requirements, life tasks, job demands, personal, social, economic problems, and so on. But education, especially adult education, needs to address the structural and systemic issues. It needs to challenge underlying premises that causes the problems and the crises the mankind is facing from a planetary level until the doorstep. We saw the list of obstacles that Alexander presented. So if we really want to address them and to cope with these obstacles, to remove them, then what we need is the change of a perspective, the critical view, the deeper look, the critical analysis of roots both at the personal level, and as Aaron said, the idea is not new, so I would like to call for Jack Mezirov and his idea of transformative learning, but especially at the personal level. But on the other hand, it's also necessary to have this deeper critical view on the systemic and structural issues, and here I would call Paulo Freire, I would say, the father of modern transformative thinking about social change and adult education. So it should be about understanding the complexity and interdependency and hierarchies in the world before we can really change it. And there is one more point that I would like to mention. Of course, it was the topic of the discussion in the previous 2 days, and it was also mentioned by the colleagues in the previous addresses, but I would like to take a bit different position on that. Of course, it's about technology and its role in the COVID-19 pandemic and how it helped to compensate the learning losses and to make learning not really fully stop. So adult learning and education moved almost fully to the virtual space. And the digitalization and the use of ICT helped to bridge the gaps the COVID-19 pandemic caused, to catch up, to reach those who are usually excluded. So online learning and platforms and applications were mushrooming. I would even say we have a phenomenon of Zoomification or Webixification and so on. But so in order to avoid that it become zombification, we need to be careful with the technology. And I see the very strong tendency, for example, not only the digital and the ICT tools, but also artificial intelligence. I refer to the topic of the coming conference, saying we need to ensure that artificial intelligence is a common good to transform education. And here comes my warning, you know, all those talks around digital humanism and so on. I'm afraid we are confusing goals with the means. And digital technology and ICT are tools and means. And in order to transform people, in order to transform society, we need more than the digital skills. We need critical thinking, reflection, conscious raising, and so on. So digital means could be helpful, but they cannot replace this critical thinking and critical conscious, even if the big portion of adult learning and education will remain non-formal and will stay in the virtual space, and we will use digital tools. In your introduction, you were talking about peace and tolerance, conflict resolution. Well, digital skills are a helpful tool, but this is not something that will help us to achieve this. So we need higher goals. And just to support this, this thesis, I would like to quote Edward Wilson, American sociobiologist, who said, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and God-like technology. So we are intensively working on the last one, on technology, but we are neglecting the other tools. We are neglecting a bit social emotional learning, embodied learning, and of course, civic education, active civic education, global civic education, which includes also learning through the dialogue about the values we want to base our society on." So I would put values first and then digital skills as just a tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you very much for these excellent comments and also for getting into this debate about technology and learning and seeing technology more as really a tool to help learning, but not substituting. Aaron, I will now turn back to you in Seoul. I mean, Chandrika started off by talking about curriculum and curriculum being overloaded and the need for really finding a way also to have this discussion around what children learn. I know curricula is something extremely close to your heart. Would you take over and share a little bit your perspective on that, but also on overall how to monitor progress in environmental education, ESD, global citizenship, education, etc.
Thanks very much. Without trying to undermine the discussion part I did actually prepare a PowerPoint with a couple slides. So I'm going to, if with your indulgence, I'm going to ask the technical group to put up the PowerPoint that I've prepared, and I'll show you a couple things that I've worked on here. I think that I can move from one to the next with this wonderful technology I have in front of me. Can everyone see the PowerPoint that I'm looking at least here in the studio? I'm not sure you can see it yet.
Not yet.
Not
No.
yet. Okay, well, let's see if they can get it together. The first slide that I'm showing is some very rough data that I put together to show just how much this issue of transformative education and transformative learning has captured the hearts and minds of a lot of academics in the last 5 to 6 years. I went through some databases, and you can really see that since 2015 and even more recently, there's been an avalanche of studies that use the term transformative education, transformative learning. Most of these, as I mentioned earlier, are focused on education in the global north, but certainly there are a lot of interesting materials to be examined. And we can also see that this is indicative of the international organizations that we care quite a bit about. I actually counted the number of times the word transforming or transformative or transformational occurred, for example, in the foundational document in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It doesn't occur at all except for in the title, whereas in the Incheon Declaration, in what's known as the Education 2030, it occurs 10 times. But in the new UNESCO report that was published just 2 months ago, it occurs almost 130 times. So we see a 12-fold interest in the use of the term transform, transformational, transformative. So certainly it's captured the hearts and minds of colleagues at UNESCO, at least with respect to this new report. Really the question becomes, how do we translate this vision into reality? Alexander talked about, some of the problems and obstacles about implementation. And this point here, the slide that I have here is mainly just to show the very diverse kinds of contents that are often under the I'm going to use a word now and then kind of problematize it, but under the umbrella term of transformative education, here you see a list, and this is based on our analysis of many of the syllabi and national curricular frameworks of countries in the Asia-Pacific region, really a very long and a diverse list of specific, let's say curricular units, particular subject areas that get incorporated in the school curriculum, and this is mainly at the lower secondary level. You can see it sometimes as part of a conventional subject. You can see it as a cross-cutting theme. You can sometimes see it as part of an interdisciplinary subject, let's say like ESD, and sometimes it occurs in a kind of a specialized subject like the name Integrated Studies or Creative Experimental Activities. So where it happens or where you find it in the curriculum is often, quite diverse too. So the question, one of the ways to try to think about this is transformative education an umbrella term? You can see my depiction here is all these other aspects of or constituent elements of transformative education are under the umbrella. So we're asking all the different kind of communities to come under this big tent. The idea of an umbrella, though, maybe is also to protect us from some of the urgent global challenges that we're facing. So in that sense, it becomes a little bit somewhat instrumental because it's meant to protect humanity from these kind of crushing global challenges. But I was struck by a comment that was made by one of the presenters on the first night of the conference, Professor Abdallah from Egypt, who talked about the great banner of transformative education. And for me, what that conjured up is kind of like the banner that you might go through on your way to a market, to a souk, to a place that has enormous a kind of diversity, you know, many different stalls and different people kind of selling their wares. And so you kind of move through a gate, people to experience many diverse kinds of educational experiences. So maybe really what we mean is a banner term, not to protect us from the global challenges, but somehow to bring in people from many different walks of life to experience different forms of transformative education. So now we move to the challenges. I think one of the big questions that I would have is that many of these challenges are not really distinctive to the notion of transformative education. Anytime a country or a group of countries agrees on a major curricular or educational reform, much of the implementation challenges that have been referenced here are not all that different. So maybe the first questions we also have to ask ourselves, what things are distinctive in terms of implementation obstacles to this idea of transformative education and the way you wish to kind of include it either in the formal curriculum or bring it into non-formal settings? What things are distinctive in terms of obstacles and how can they be addressed? And I really do think that you know, the organization of most ministries of education really creates more obstacles than it overcomes, in the sense that, you know, there are really different turfs, different policy documents, different laws, different streams of data that are being reported in different ministries, all of which kind of provide some a small element of lifelong learning, but it's really difficult to see countries move and create systems that coordinate across different ministries to really develop lifelong learning policies that include both the formal, the non-formal, and the informal. And so, and the other point that I think has been made by quite a few different people is that one of the key parts of the system is really in the upper secondary level, when so many students are kind of, you know, their day-to-day lives and often many times their evenings are really devoted toward cramming for a very high stakes examination that they need in order to complete their secondary school levels. And this becomes, I think, a real bottleneck, because these are also young people that are in some ways most impressionable, that are at the period of their lives where they can really learn what it means to be active citizens, what it means to kind of go out into the world and think about transforming it. And actually the system is organized in order to keep them very quiet and docile and to kind of prepare for an examination. So I see this as actually being a real challenge. And finally, you know, as a challenge, I would say that we have a long way to go as a community of researchers to really unpack some of the kind of arguments that are being put forward about the both short-term and certainly the medium and longer-term impacts of exposure to some kind of transformative educational experience. Not only do we have very little evidence about, you know, the short-term impact, how much, let's say, how much do students' hearts and minds and actions change, but we have almost no longitudinal research. We have very little research that actually follows as students become, as it were, something different as they move into adult lives, and to what extent these educational experiences deepen their being or their way in the world. And I think that's really an incredibly formative challenge. So I also, it's interesting to go back, as we've been doing. One of the most interesting quotes that I often use in my classes comes from the Jomtien conference 31 years ago, when there was the first time also a very transformative conference where the international community came together with civil society, with the international organizations. And in the final document, not in the declaration, the Commonwealth Secretary talked about the importance of learning that is a process of growth and not a product to be acquired, that learning is a journey, not a destination, and the creative potential of the individual, of imagination, of spiritual and aesthetic values, of community spirit are justifiable in their own right and not easily measurable in the short term. And this really then kind of creates the dilemma. If we don't try to measure transformative education, does it really count? You know, will its hold on the imagination of policymakers, on parents, on educators, and students subside if we don't make a concerted effort, despite all the challenges, to capture some aspects of transformative education, both quantitatively and qualitatively? And I think one of the first things that we need to do is really build a new repository of documents that are related to this area that can be used for all kinds of different purposes, to really see our countries moving from their overall kind of general commitment that they may have on paper, to really see changes in terms of curricular subjects in the syllabi, in the textbooks in particular. This is a way of actually trying to understand what goes on in what's often referred to as the enacted curriculum, as the implemented curriculum. And I think here we have much to gain by trying to think of innovative ways to try to capture these very diverse journeys that learners are engaged in, both individually and collectively. And it's only with this kind of attention that I think we can continue to really push forward these ideas in the future. Sorry it took so long with the PowerPoint here, but these are some points that I wanted to bring out.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for these excellent additional points and perspectives, and thank you also for I think somewhat optimistic and positive message in the sense that, as you point out, there's so many things which are going on, as you demonstrated with the umbrella or banner slide. And which is, I think, a very positive thing. The issue is now really how can we bring it together and really, make sure that things are happening on the ground. So we'll get back to that question a little later if we do have time, because time is running very fast. And it's my pleasure now to turn to Mr. Gunasekara. You're from the Ministry of Education, sir, in Sri Lanka, and you've been leading the work in ensuring safe and healthy learning environments in schools in Sri Lanka. Would you have any further recommendations for us to consider on how to improve learning environments also from a transformative perspective? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vibeke. I think I have one recommendation. I think before we think about the transformative education, we have concern about the rejoining of school student. I think under this COVID situation, most of students in our developing country, many students drop out. I think we should think about that. And also I have another point. I think we have to think what is the reality in our system, how we cover the learning losses, and what about our exam system. And that's why I think this is the I prepared that presentation about our system, and now I can explain this. Yes, next slide, please. Okay, our vision is healthy and active younger generation, and our mission empower school children to develop the competencies to promote one's health and family and the all community health. Yes, next one. Under the health promotion concept, we focuses five directions. One, formulating policies, developing skills and knowledges, and gain community participation, and create healthy environment and reoriented health services. That is our main focuses. Next one. Yes. Under the health promotion program, we change our perception of this one. Earlier, we think it health sector responsibility, and it is doctors and public health inspectors involved everything, and part of the awareness session health promotion is, and vaccination, dental and BMI checking, and that activity is only health promotion, we think past. But now we totally change our perception, and I think it is a part of the health and nutrition in our system, and it is responsibility of the all stakeholders, parents and other stakeholders, student, parents and other all. And it is knowledge through the participation, all the activities. And child-friendly facilities, we provided child-friendly facilities, and everyone should responsible to all. And then now we measure not only quantity, quality, and also behavioral change. I think that we measure. Then in Sri Lanka, so far we have done a solution for the issues. We implement many programs under the school health umbrella coverage. I think you can read, everyone you can read, I don't read one by one. Okay, next one, please. Okay, this is the important thing. Once Jack Masiro said the transformative education starts after the unoriented dilemma. I think it's word, I'm right. Now we are facing that situation under the COVID situation. We have no earlier experience. Under this situation, we introduce many activities to school. We start schools and now conducting it forward. We give instructions to the school to start under the COVID guideline. I think you can see this all. And some activities here mentioned. I think now we are success in this process. I think you all can see this. We can conduct school safely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gunasekara, for this very practical example of how you are trying to transform things in Sri Lanka. Let me turn to Mr. Lim in Seoul for you also to share your perspective on the question I asked.
Yes, thank you, Vibeke. I want to raise the question of educational inequality. Now in many countries, educational inequality directly leads to economic inequality, and vice versa. Economic inequality leads to educational inequality. Of course, this is not new. It's an old problem. But in today's digital environment, and especially under the corona pandemic, this problem of educational inequality and economic inequality reinforcing each other is getting worse. Certainly, this has a terrible impact on transformative education in several ways. Firstly, when the tendency of educational inequality leading to economic inequality is strengthened, education becomes even more competitive. And more competition in education is bad for transformative education. As we have seen during this forum, in a competitive environment of education, learners are less likely to develop and practice empathy, collaboration, and solidarity. Secondly, educational inequality reinforces the perception of education as an instrument. Education is regarded as an instrument for advancing individual interests. On this perception, learning does not give you any joy or pleasure, but pains. When you bear with this pain and work hard to get high scores on tests and enter good universities, you will get rewarded by a shockingly high salary. And this is justified in the name of meritocracy. When education is just an instrument for individual gains, it is extremely difficult for learners and teachers to take collective action to make changes in schools or communities together. So my conclusion is that we need to consider this problem of educational inequality seriously in today's fast-changing context. And one starting point for tackling this problem would be to reduce the emphasis on instrumentality of education and strengthen the other aspect of education, that is, education as an intrinsic good. Education is good in itself. Thank you.
Thank you for adding this also extremely important point, Mr. Lim. A big question, how to do this, but you are certainly right in pointing out that tension between making education instrumental and looking at the broader purpose of education, and the two not going very well hand in hand. We have almost come to the conclusion of this session, but I wouldn't want to close without also asking my colleague June if there are any questions from the audience, and give them an opportunity to interact with the panel. June, what do you see in the chat or in the Q&A?
Thank you, Vibeke, for that. We received a couple of questions, and I took one. Here is the question. How to combine and engage the whole institutional approach and learning outside in real political world where transformation is happening? Over.
Any volunteers to respond to this question, or could I ask maybe Katarina if you wanted to have a go? He was kind of talking a little bit along these lines, and maybe afterwards, if Mr. Lim, you would also have a comment on it. Katarina?
Yes, thank you. As a matter of fact, it matches some of my thoughts when I was reading the recommendations. And what was mentioned is, among other things, transformation that should happen throughout the society. So it has to do also with this question in terms of who participates, who are the partners. And there is also a recommendation that I see as linked to this one. Let students, teachers, and other stakeholders co-create pedagogies, materials, and monitoring mechanism. So I see this part, including the question from the audience, as a question about the partnership and cooperation. And here my recommendation would be to include the civil society and the existing practices of civil society, because we know that civil society is one of the main providers of education, adult education, lifelong learning, non-formal education and learning in many parts of the world. And there is a rich experience in pedagogies and methods, you know, interactive methods, co-constructive methods. Let me just mention the reflect method, based on Paulo Freire's ideas and used widely in many parts of the world, participatory research methods, and so on. So there is a rich experience and there are really fruitful practices that we could refer to and not start inventing from the scratch, and including civil society, you know, with this experience, of course, including at all levels, policy planning, making action plans, strategies and action plans, also monitoring in implementation. But then I would also like to say that this inclusion of the partners should really go, you know, from bottom to up. So I said civil society, local communities, they are crucial in this process of transforming and translating the global goals and ambitions. And we heard at the beginning to change the world, which is really high ambition. So if you wanted to make, to be functional at the local level, really need to include the local communities, meaning formal players, formal education, civil society, entrepreneurship, and so on. But on the other hand, what we also need is to include policymakers. And then I'm again at the adult education talking about, you know, peace and war, climate change, financial crisis, debts on developing countries, and so on. We need to work with the people that are making decisions in these important areas. And again, it's urgent. I know it sounds like mission impossible to change the mind of the adults, but isn't changing the world also a mission impossible? So I think transformative education is at least on a good way. So that's what we need to go for, and including really all having this whole system approach, not only whole school, but the whole society and whole system approach, and including every important player in this lifelong learning chain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katarina. Mr. Lim, would you have anything to add, or?
Yes, just briefly. During this forum, we have been talking about holistic approach very much, and I think we should apply this principle of holistic approach to this question, how to combine whole school approach with the whole community approach. So as Professor Katarina has just stressed, we need a kind of whole society approach, which means we have to include, we have to take the principle of inclusiveness in our effort, in our attempt to make changes in our education system and more broadly in our society and the world. We need broad partnership and collaboration, and we have to, for this joint effort, we have to invite the researchers and education policymakers and also practitioners of adult education and of course teachers. So I think UNESCO has a role in this regard, and if I have some time, I will make some concrete suggestions. Thank you.
So, well, thank you so much for responding to that question, and thank you for the question from the audience. We really have come to the end, so I will just close by giving each one of you, we have 5 minutes remaining, just give you 30 seconds, 45 seconds, each one of you to just highlight what you see as the most important step and recommendation to UNESCO, to national governments, to the larger education community that we need to do to really help accelerate the achievement of transformative education. Who would want to start? Aaron, can I start with you in Seoul?
Sure. I have two things to say. One, I would agree with Chandrika, who at the beginning said, this is really a very special moment in time. This is an opportunity. Things that a couple years ago we could not have imagined in terms of changes in educational policy we see happening daily and all the time. So there is something very unique about this period of time, and I think we need to seize this opportunity and really reach much broader, deeper, more comprehensively than we might have imagined in the past. And the second thought that I'd leave you with is that I really do think that we need to do more to empower, engage, activate both the teachers and the students or the learners. I think that we often come with very top-down, very stultifying policies. And one of the things that I think is really at the base of much of this movement in transformative education is to find ways to really engage learners, to enable them to really be co-creators in their learning experiences. And I think that would take us a long way forward.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for these last words from your side. Anyone else would want to just give a final comment? Chandrika?
Thank you, Vibeke. Two things. One of the constant feedback that we get at the STG Academy is that why am I not learning this in school? All of the materials that we put out. So to my mind, if we want change, and young people have demonstrated over the last few years that they are capable, both despite their schooling systems and their college education, they're capable of teaching themselves and of organizing themselves. So I think if we want change at large scale to happen quickly, politicians will move if they have pressure from the ground. If this fits into their vision of the future, that's, I think, the second motivation, because education is such a project of nation building for most countries that I think this has to, the elements of this have to fit into that. And then the third is peer pressure. So this is where this is an appeal to UNESCO. We are trying to do this with Mission 4.7 with you, which is to try and persuade heads of state, politicians, policymakers, to really embrace the elements of transformative education. And I think the more countries that begin to do this, the more our job is to amplify, support, encourage, and recognize. And that is how this will spread, but we need to move quickly.
Thank you so much, Chandrika. And I'm awfully sorry, but I'm being told to wrap up the session because we need to move on to the next set of parallel sessions. But I cannot do that without saying a big thank you to our panelists for really an excellent and very, very interesting, informative, educative, and super interesting morning. So thank you so much, Chandrika, Katarina, Mr. Gunasekara, Mr. Lim, and Darren Benavot for being with us this morning. And so with this, we close this plenary session, and I invite you all to move on to where we have 3 concurrent sessions now, as you will see from the program. And I wish you an excellent next few hours before we close the whole forum in a couple of hours. Thank you so much and have a good day. Enjoy the rest few discussions. Bye.
Thank you.